In this video, we're going to take a look at how to do matrix operations with the TI-84 calculator. Let's start with adding and subtracting matrices. So we're going to add and subtract these two matrices. Both of them are 3x2 matrices, and one will add and in the other will subtract. Now, whenever we start out doing anything with matrices, we're going to have to input those matrices into the calculator. So the way to input a matrix into the calculator is to hit second and then this matrix button right here. And then we scroll over to edit. Edit matrix A. Remember, matrix A was a 3x2 matrix, so I just hit 3, enter, 2, enter. And then I put in the values for my matrix A. In my case, that was 5, 7, 2, -1, -3, and 6. So now matrix A has the values input. I'm going to go back to the matrix menu and then edit matrix B as well. Matrix B was also 3x2, and the first row was 2, 0. The second row was -8, 1, and the third row was 4, 4. Then I hit second and quit, and I go back to the home screen. Now what I do if I want to add those two matrices or subtract those two matrices is I go back into the matrix menu, and this time in the names, I just hit enter. So I hit enter A, and if I hit enter right now, it'll show me the matrix on the right-hand side. The same thing with B. If I just hit enter, it'll show me the matrix B on the right-hand side. If we want to add matrix A and B, I just hit matrix A, then the plus sign, obviously the plus sign is here, and then do the same thing for matrix B. I go back into the matrix menu, select B, A plus B, that's matrix A plus B, is equal to 7, 7, -6, 0, 1, 10. And similarly, if I want to do matrix A minus matrix B, I'd go back into the matrix menu and I'd subtract instead of add. Now, another way you can do that is just hit second enter and change your addition to a subtraction if you'd like. So that is how we would add two matrices and subtract two matrices on the TI-84 calculator. Now, if our matrices do not have the same dimension, then we can't add or subtract those, and that'll be reflected on the calculator as well. So let's look at this case. We have our same A, but we have a different matrix over here that I want to add. This matrix has 2 rows and 3 columns. I've already input that as my matrix C on my calculator. So matrix C was that matrix. Matrix A is still matrix A. So we would take matrix A plus matrix C. Again, you can either scroll down or you can hit the number 3. And if I try to add matrix A and matrix C, it'll say that there is an error because the dimensions of those two matrices do not match. So that's adding and subtracting matrices on your calculator. If the dimensions don't match, then we can't add or subtract them. Now, what if I want to do a scalar multiple of a matrix, like taking 4 times my matrix A? Or taking something like 9 times my matrix A plus 4 times my matrix B. Well, I can combine operations of scalar multiplication and addition, or I can just do scalar multiplication. Remember, scalar multiplication is where I take the 4 and I multiply it times each numerical value in the matrix. Well, our calculator can do that too, and in a very straightforward way. So all we would have to do is take 4 and then times it by matrix A if I want to take 4 times matrix A. 4 times matrix A is this. You can see that each entry in our matrix A has now been multiplied by 4. You can also just do 4 and then right next to matrix A and do the same thing. So if you don't put any operation in, it assumes that the 4 is being multiplied. And if we want to combine scalar multiplication with addition, then I can do that. 9 times matrix A minus 4 times matrix B, or maybe 9 times matrix A plus 4 times matrix B. I just type it in as such, and every time I just go back and get the matrix. Hit that matrix menu in the matrix menu. Excuse me. So that's how we do addition and scalar multiplication with matrices on our calculator. What if we wanted to do matrix multiplication on the TI-84 calculator? Well, that's going to go in a very similar way. Let's do these two examples. Here we have a matrix, I'll call 3, 5, 1, -2 matrix A, and I'll call 8, 4, -4, -6 matrix B. So I'm going to take matrix A times matrix B, and then matrix B times matrix A. Now, I have already plugged these matrices into my calculator. So if we went to the matrix menu and then over to edit, notice that A and B are already 2 by 2. You can see that A, I've already input those values for A. And then in the same way, if I go into the matrix menu and edit matrix B, I've already input the values for B. So if I want to multiply, it's pretty straightforward. I take matrix A and then the multiply or the times key, and then go back into the matrix menu under names, go to matrix B. So A times B is that. By the way, if you just go A and then B right next to each other, it's going to assume you mean multiplication as well. So that's another option. Now, if I wanted to do B times A, then I need to put in the B first and the A second. Notice that A times B is not the same thing as B times A. Matrix multiplication is not commutative in general. So be very careful about which one you plug in first, which one you plug in second. Now you can multiply with other matrices as well. Here we have our matrix A again, that 3, 5, 1, -2. And then we want to multiply times 2, 4, 3 in the first row, -7, -2, 0 in the second row. And then we'll multiply in the reverse order as well. So what I've done is I've already plugged in that matrix into my matrix D of the calculator. So matrix D is that second matrix. And remember, matrix A, oops, clear that out. I thought I was at the home screen, matrix A is still going to be 3, 5, 1, -2. So if I take matrix A times matrix D, I get the product of those two. So I can multiply A times D. However, if we did that in the reverse way, again, we go back into the matrix menu each time, matrix D times matrix A, that will give me a dimension mismatch because when you multiply two matrices, the number of columns in the first matrix has to match the number of rows in the second matrix. So I can't multiply those two because of the dimensions not matching up well. But this shows how to do matrix multiplication on your calculator. Now, one last thing on our calculator that we're going to do is deal with the inverse of a matrix on the calculator and how to multiply with inverse of a matrix. So I'll call matrix -1, 0, 1, 2 my new matrix A, and this is still my matrix D. So in my calculator, I would go to get an inverse. What I do is I go back to the matrix menu. I'll recall A. Now, just to confirm that I have the right matrix now in matrix A, I'll show you that I have that in there. I redid that on my own. And then what I would do is recall that A, and then the inverse of A we can find by just taking this x -1 button, which is right there. And if I hit that and then hit enter, I get the inverse of A. Remember, the matrix multiplied times the inverse of the matrix should give you back the identity. And sure enough, if you do that either on the calculator or by hand, you get back the identity. Now, this A inverse, let me pull that up again, has decimal versions of the entries. If you want fractional versions of the entries, then you can just hit the math key and then fraction. It'll take this matrix and it'll turn each decimal entry that it can into a fraction entry. And then you hit enter. And sure enough, each of the 0.5s becomes 1/2. So that's how we can use this inverse button. Again, the inverse button is right here. In fact, it's the matrix button. Now remember that our matrix D was that 2x3 matrix. If I try to use the inverse button on matrix D, what it's going to give out is an invalid dimension because matrices which are not square will not have inverses. So notice that it says that on my screen. Invalid dimension, you can only get the inverse of square matrices. One last little thing about inverses can be shown in using this matrix, which I'll call F, well, which I've named F. I have F as the matrix 2, 4, 3, 6. If I try to do an inverse of matrix F, what would happen is I would get an error because F is a singular matrix, and singular matrices do not have inverses. So that is going to give me an error because F was a singular matrix. Now we can do lots of things with matrix inverses, but one thing in particular that we do in solving a matrix equation is we take the inverse of A times a 2 by 1 matrix. So I'm going to use the same A I had before, and I'll use a 2 by 1 matrix that is B, which has entries of 4 and 10. And I will find A inverse times B using my calculator. So once again, let me just confirm that matrix A is the matrix A that we have. And then the matrix B, I actually already input that as matrix with 4, 10. And so if we're doing this, I can go into the matrix menu, click A, hit the inverse button. Again, the inverse button's right there. And then times by into the matrix menu, B, and then hit enter. Notice that I get a -4, 7. And you can solve systems of linear equations using matrix inverses. So that is a lot of operations on the TI-84 calculator using matrices. I try to do that fairly quickly. Obviously, if you want a complete analysis of what the calculator is doing, you can see how to do these things by hand if you want by looking at the full lecture video.